Last week, we saw the first foreigners come into the American story, which up to that time had been, pretty largely a Spanish tale. Spain's claims to the New World based upon, prior discovery, papal grants, had been challenged by European rivals. Now, at first, they were content to raid Spain's treasure fleets on the high seas. But little by little, French privateers, English sea dogs, Dutch sea beggars began to move into American waters and to attack and bedevil her. As the century closed, however, Spain was still in a fairly strong position, at least on the American side. She had lost no territory. Perfectly true, she had lost treasure. And a number of her coastal ports, her coastal towns had been rather seriously disturbed, but it was not in the Americas that she was so badly off. Toward the end of that century, however, little by little, certain of her European rivals, particularly the Dutch and the English, had challenged her at home. And in 1588, by a fortuitous combination of a storm and the bravery of the English, her invincible armada had been defeated. Now, this had very important consequences for the American story. Within a few years, she made peace with her rivals. She made peace with the French in the Treaty of Vervins. She made peace with the English a few years later in the Treaty of London. She agreed to a 12-year truce with the Dutch. Now, in all of these, she had to admit the validity of a certain international principle, the principle that was known as effective occupation. In other words, as regards the New World, she admitted that what she did not and could not hold was free game for the first comers. And very quickly, other Europeans began to come now that her sea power was broken and she couldn't keep them out. From point of view of time, the English were the first. And that's the story that I'd like to recall today. Now, for example, though it may seem rather strange, the English desire for overseas colonies awakened rather slowly. Actually, you might say that John Hawkins, whom we spoke of last week, was the pioneer. But really, Hawkins was interested, and the people who backed him were interested rather in trade with the Spanish colonies than in settlement. However, as the English challenge began to develop, the stories that became current in England, spread by the sea dogs and the like, of Spanish wealth and power and so on, these awakened a good deal of English interest. Then toward the end of the century, one of England's great promoters, or one of what we might say, one of the great promoters of the future English empire, Parson Richard Hakluyt, began to edit his famous volumes and began to hammer at the Englishmen, hit them on the point of national pride. If the French can have, I beg your pardon, if the Spanish can have an empire, why can't England? Are the English are they poorer? Are they any worse than the Spaniards? We should have an empire. Little by little, this propaganda began to take effect. Now, we may think it rather curious, but nevertheless, in the early 17th, the late 16th, the early 17th century, there was a conviction in England that the realm was overpopulated. It seems very strange to us today because in modern times, England has sustained about 4 times the population she had in 1600. But nevertheless, whether they were correct or not, this is what they said. We are overpopulated. Now, I haven't got time to go into the reasons for that. A number of them will be connected with the suppression of the monasteries. During the Middle Ages, the monasteries took care in their social service operations of the bulk of the English poor and the English statesmen in general never came in contact with the great number of unemployed, of poor, of vagabonds, and so on. But now, with the monasteries suppressed, which Henry VIII did, these people are thrown as a charge on the state, and the state more or less stands aghast at their number. And one conclusion they came to was, well, maybe there are more Englishmen than England can support. And therefore, colonies began to appeal to English leaders on the safety valve angle. In other words, the surplus population could be drained off, and England would be able to take care of those she had. Now, there's another group that's becoming interested about the end of this century, and these are the merchants, the mercantile, the ship owner group. They're beginning to feel that they need more markets, that they need more places from which they can pick up raw products which will be processed by growing English industry. And colonies serve as a very excellent source, both for markets and for materials. Then, too, as they begin to think of continuing this war against the Spaniards, they feel that bases in America where they will not have the long run across the Atlantic to attack Spanish possessions, these are valuable. Now, all of these motives, official motives we'll call them, gradually were lumped together, and early in the 17th century, the English decided to plant settlements in the New World. Now, the several attempts that they had made in the latter decades of the 16th century proved abortive. For example, in the early 80s, Sir Humphrey Gilbert tried to found a settlement in Newfoundland, and that failed. Then his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, tried on 2 occasions to found a settlement along the Carolina area of the Atlantic seaboard. And in both of those instances, England failed again. It was not until 1607 that she was able to found at Jamestown her first permanent settlement in the New World. Now, I don't want to take time to go through in detail the whole list of these settlements. Let's recall them quickly and note their chronological spacing. And then in the latter half of the discussion, I think it might be much more interesting if we were to say something about the motives that pushed individual Englishmen to come and settle in this new world. But let's just review the process. In 1606, 2 companies were chartered by King James of England, the Plymouth Company and the London Company. Now, the Plymouth Company was given territory to the north here, and the London Company was given territory to the south. In 1606, the London Company sent out a colony which founded a settlement, it was not going to last, up in Maine on the Kennebec. About the same time, the London Company sent a group out, and early in 1607, they chose a site, the site of Jamestown. It was rather poorly chosen, but nevertheless, they were able to stick it out. 1607, they lay the foundations of Virginia. Now, one of the expeditions that was coming out to bring supplies to Virginia happened to stop, or happened to run into the Bermudas. They'd be off this map over here off the Virginia-Carolina coast. In 1615, Sir George Somers obtained permission to begin a settlement there. The next group of Englishmen are the famous Pilgrims. You know their background, how they got into trouble at home, they transferred or moved over to Holland, then decided that they might have greater freedom to practice life as they envisioned it, practice the religion to which they were wedded, if they moved to the New World. Now, they came over in 1620, and they came over with a charter from the London Company and were originally destined for Delaware. But in the process of crossing, they were pushed out somewhat, and as we well know, they ended up in founding the colony of Plymouth up off Cape Cod, or on Cape Cod, in Massachusetts. Now, next, during that decade of the 1620s, you have operations in the Caribbean. A number of the small islands in the Caribbean are taken over by the English. Then at the end of the decade of the 20s, the 1620s again, the Puritans. They have run into considerable difficulty with Charles now, James the First's son, Charles the First, and he, through the leadership of his Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Laud, is really hounding the Puritans. And they decide, why sit still and take this, when we can take a chance, get a charter, and transfer our operations to the New World, and there enjoy freedom. Now, that they did, as you know, and during the period of the 1620s, great numbers, thousands of Puritans came to New England, centering first in Massachusetts, and then, little by little, expanding, for one reason or another, into the Connecticut Valley, up into New Hampshire, on down into Rhode Island. Now, also in this decade of the 30s, you had the first so-called proprietary colony along the Atlantic seaboard. A grant was made not to a company now, as had been the case with the Puritans, had been the case with Virginia, but the grant was made to an individual. The individual was George Calvert, who became known as Lord Baltimore. And you might say, if we want to make a funny here, here's a man that switched from Calvert. He's generally known as Lord Baltimore. All right, he sets up a colony here in between, or just to the north, let us say, of Virginia, the colony of Maryland. Then there's a period when there's a great deal of trouble at home in England. The Puritans are fighting the king, then the Puritans are in control, and there is very little colony planting. However, in 1660, the Stuarts are invited back to take over the throne of England in what is known as the Stuart Restoration, and Charles II, the ruling Stuart, is a very generous individual with somebody else's property. He tells his brother James, he says, look, Jim, I know that the Dutch, we'll see something about that next week, the Dutch have a colony along the Hudson here. Now, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you the territory between New England and Maryland. It's all yours. You can do whatever you want with it, but go out and capture it. And we know that James got an expedition together, overpowered the Dutch. It wasn't too difficult. And out of this middle section grew the colonies of New York, named after himself. He was Duke of York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and Delaware. About the same time, or actually just a little bit later, Charles granted to several of his friends territory to the south of Virginia, and there emerge in time the two Carolinas. North Carolina, which is a rather rowdy colony, and South Carolina, which you might say is sort of a gentlemanly colony. A little bit later in the next century, as a buffer against the Spaniards who are in Florida, the English found the colony of Georgia. Now, that is, in brief review, the story of the English planting in or along the Atlantic seaboard. In 1670, they begin to operate up here. It isn't shown on this map, but up here in the Hudson Bay area, a fur trading operation. But by now, the English extend along the Atlantic seaboard. They have this holding up here in, at Hudson Bay. They are down in the Caribbean and are quite well established. They have found, grounded, so to speak, an American empire. Now, as I said, I'm not going to take time to do more than recall that for you. You know those stories very well. John Smith and Pocahontas and Bradford and Roger Williams and all the rest of them. Let's say something about why Englishmen came to North America. This gets us down, well, this gets the story down to us. Now, the men who came to the Americas, whether north or south, whether they were Spaniards or whether they were Portuguese, whether they were French or the like, they all had a certain number of common motives, common denominators, if we might call it such. But each of these groups had certain special motives. Sometimes you can put the motives for colony planting in a rather neat capsule. For example, they often say that the Spaniards came to the Americas motivated by the 3 G's: gold, glory, and the gospel. We know, and we'll review it a week or so hence, that fish first and then furs attracted the Frenchmen. Now, it wasn't quite so easy, or it isn't quite so easy, to put the English motives in a capsule. However, there are 2 or 3 which I think are worth discussing very briefly. And with this advantage, if we understand these 2 or 3 motives that brought Englishmen to the colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, we are laying a foundation for understanding a great deal about the United States which grew out of these colonies. Now, among these motives, let me sketch 1 or other of them here to help you. Let's put down as the first, land. That may seem a little strange to us. But if we get that concept of land hunger, we have taken a great step forward in understanding not only English colonial history, but understanding a good deal of the story of the United States. First, we have to go back to Europe and recognize how important land was to Europeans. Now, to us Americans, who have always had land available, all you needed was the cash, or in some instances, all you needed was the nerve. Can I use the term guts? To move in, squat on a piece of land, and then practically defy the government to put you off. Land has been available. In Europe, it was not that case. And earlier European society had, to a very large extent, been built upon land. The people who were the leaders in society, who were the aristocracy, the nobles, they were the ones who were the landowners. They were the ones who made the policies, who were at the top of the social ladder, who had the token of wealth. Land was wealth. Now, the common people, through this, the medieval centuries, they built their hopes upon land. If they could only get land, then they might be able to be somebody. After all, that was, practically speaking, the only thing that differentiated them from the nobles. The nobles owned land, they didn't. Now, here was an opportunity. Here was a great wilderness. Land was available. Land was cheap. Land could almost be had for the taking. Now, put yourself in the position of the little man in Europe, or let's say specifically in England, in the 17th century. Here was a chance to get ahead. Now, it involved a certain amount of danger, that's true. But, after all, when we are looking for wealth, when we're looking for security, when we're looking for prestige and the like, we're perfectly willing to take chances. We're perfectly willing to work long hours. All right, their long hours, their chances were crossing the Atlantic and facing the wilderness, facing its dangers, but ending up with something upon which they could build securely. Now, another motive was the motive of adventure. Let's call it that. Now, all of us humans, no matter how well, satisfied we are, how well set we are, we're always interested in that other side of the mountain. And particularly if some people have been on the other side of the mountain and have come back to report to us that there are great opportunities there. We get, the Germans called it the Wanderlust. We call it, maybe not quite as nicely, we call it the itchy foot. You get the itchy foot. Now, a number of people decided, okay, we're not getting anywhere here. We can at least have some fun, some excitement. Let's go over. That probably motivated a great number of them. And maybe they were trying to get away from things. There's still a third group of motives which are very important, and I'm going to call your attention to the fact, when I write it, I'm going to write it in the plural. Intolerances. Now, I'm pulling that into the plural for this reason. When we say intolerance as a motive for peopling America, immediately into our mind snaps the idea of religious intolerance. We know that during the 17th century, if you didn't agree with the established church in England, you were in the ranks of the dissenters. And periodically, for one reason or another, the English monarchs decided to put the thumbscrews on the dissenters. The Puritans, the Catholics, later the Quakers, and the like. They wanted everybody lockstepping, religious-wise as in other ways. And the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the Catholics of Maryland, ultimately the people, the Quakers who peopled New Jersey, peopled Pennsylvania, one of the reasons why they came was so that they would have the freedom to practice religion as they saw it they felt it should be practiced. Now, that's an obvious type of intolerance. A type of intolerance that we overlook is what we might call socio-economic intolerance. Patterns were set and had been set for centuries in Europe, and if you were not on the inside, it was practically impossible for you to crack through. If you were one of the little people, if you didn't have land, then you didn't have much wealth, you didn't have much social prestige, and all the way down the line. And there was practically nothing you could do about it. The society just wasn't going to yield to you. Now, many people, this is kind of hooked up with this motive of land, but it goes a little bit farther. Many people figured, okay, we can go to the New World and we'll have a chance to become somebody. They faced the dangers, and they were great. The dangers of the crossing, the dangers of getting settled in the wilderness, and all of that. I think that we will agree that we're terrifically happy that they were brave, because they laid the foundations upon which our great nation has been built, along with the foundations of one kind or another that the Spaniards laid, that the French laid, that the Dutch laid, and so on. Let's take, this is such a fascinating story, and we've had to cover it so rapidly that books are rather important this time. Now, this is a personal opinion, but I think one of the most delightful stories of the colonial period is Lewis B. Wright, The Atlantic Frontier. It's an excellent story, beautifully written, and his ideas, his concepts are very stimulating. Now, here's another important story. Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker, the first Americans. Wertenbaker is one of our great American colonial historians. This belongs to a series of books, A History of American Life. As time goes on, we'll pull more and more out of that series. Then several books in this series we've already called your attention, The Chronicles of America. This one has to do with the foundations in the South, the pioneers of the Old South by, let me check it again, Mary Johnston. Quite interesting. For New England, you have a book by James Truslow Adams, the first of a series of 3 on the history of New England. This is The Founding of New England, James T. Adams. Many of you know him, and know him rather well as the author of the Epic of America. Now, there have been great American colonial historians, and we could take many works of Charles M. Andrews. I'm just going to call this one to your attention. Our earliest colonial settlements. Here is a very fascinating work by a man who practically devoted his life to the colonial period. He has an excellent 4-volume treatment of the colonies. He's got a book in this series, The Fathers of New England, the colonial folkways. Besides that, we might also mention Osgood, who did a great deal of work on on this colonial period. You'll not lack books if you have the time to read. And remember this: history is largely a matter of reading. How much can you read? And the more you read, the more you will be attracted, and the better grasp you'll have not only of history, but as we said in our first lecture, the better grasp you'll have of yourself, of your neighbors, your associates, and the like, because that's what history is. History is that story. Now, next week, we're going on to another one of these rival empires, rivals to the Spaniards, namely that of the Dutch, and we'll say something in passing about the Swedes. So, wooden shoes on the Hudson is our next discussion.